Happy Monday and happy holidays, everybody. Every Monday, what I do is my best of one, best of three meta review for Standard. So we're on to the 6th week of Foundations. We still have several more to go, not looking at a new Standard set until February. So if you're new here, what I like to do is use a third-party tracker called Untapped. And the reason why I use that is to remove my bias about what I think is the best deck and just go off of what the data says is the best deck for everybody from Bronze to Mythic. And one of the downsides to this is that it can get a little bit repetitive. So I do my best to try to add things every week, though, to make it something entertaining. So hopefully I can accomplish that. So we'll cover best of one first, and then we'll do best of three. And for best of three, I do the standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online, which is a very competitive global tournament, and I think is a pretty good way to keep your finger on the meta of what's going on in best of three. So what I'll do is talk about how the deck is changing throughout the weeks. This is so that if you are a new player and you're looking to craft the deck, you can kind of figure out what's part of the core and then what's kind of in more of the tech spots or the flex spots, and as well as maybe just give you some ideas for your own builds. And then I also do kind of off-meta picks on Sundays to try to cover some of the decks that exist in the meta that aren't in the top 8 on the tracker. And so this is going to be based off of performance, not by popularity. So there will be some popular archetypes that we won't cover today, and that's just how it goes. So I also do gameplay videos to kind of showcase my builds and my takes on these decks as well, all with the point of just trying to help you out and enjoy Magic the Gathering, because it's the holidays. Maybe we've got some people who are playing Magic for the first time, right? So first up on number one in tier 1 is Mono Red Aggro, and this deck has been in tier 1 at the number 1 spot for a while. Part of it is because of it's difficult to play perfectly. It's easy to play well enough, right? So this week what we see is they dropped the 4 copies of Shock to bring in 4 copies of Lightning Strike. And this is, again, this is kind of matchup dependent. Everything in Magic is pros and cons. So the Shocks are better at countering the Manifold Mouse and the Slickshot Hero, Heartfire Hero, and Slickshot Show Off, in Mono Red. Whereas the Lightning Strikes are better against the 3 toughness creatures like Glissa and the Unstoppable Slasher in Black. So it kind of depends on what you're experiencing in the meta, whether or not you're going to want to run the Shocks or the Lightning Strikes. The other thing that I like to do throughout the weeks, in case this is your first time back into Standard after a long period of time, is talk about the matchups. So this deck is favored against Dimir Midrange, Azorius Oculus, and Mono Black Discard. It's weak against, it's a coin flip against Golgari Midrange, largely whether or not they hit into their black single point interaction. And then it's weak to Mono Black Midrange, Boros Auras. Boros Auras, the Sheltered by Ghosts, can give this deck a problem, and that's kind of where the Shock can be advantageous. But the Lifegain, it's a difficult matchup nonetheless. The other thing I like to do is talk about the cards that are the top performing cards in your opening hand, just to kind of give you some slight mulligan advice if you're once again returning. So the Heartfire Hero and the Manifold Mouse, especially together, have been particularly powerful turn 1, turn 2s. And then the Hired Claw has also been very impressive on turn 1, because you can then threaten it. You don't have to put the +1/+1 counter on it, which makes it hard for your opponent to block, and then it hits in for 2 as a 1-drop. So it's almost like a 2/2, sort of. And they do stack. So if you have multiple Hired Claws, remember to play it before you attack. It's a mistake I've made as well. So that one's number 1. Number 2, according to Untapped, is Mardu Aggro. And this one's also in tier 1, which just means that they're statistically comparable within the same standard deviation by win rate. So Mardu Aggro is largely, it's either a blend of mono red and playing the Calisel Sword, or it's Boros Auras and playing the Calisel Sword. And you're playing the Calisel Sword for the Burn Together fling, basically, off of the adventure side. And this week we see a little bit more of a return towards the mono red. So we've dropped 2 copies of the Manifold Mouse. We've dropped the 4 copies of the Optimistic Scavenger, which is the 1-drop that gets +1/+1 whenever you play an enchantment, to bring in the full playset of the Monastery Swiftspear, as well as the 4 Slickshot Show-Offs. And you're going to see these kind of fluctuate depending on the meta's single point interaction and how many people are playing the shocks instead of the lightning strikes. So there's kind of a give and take throughout the weeks, right? We're dropping the Feather of Flight, which is the +1/+0 and flying, and you draw a card in enchantment. We're bringing in the 2 Demonic Ruckus as a way to kind of... It works particularly nice with the Slickshot Show-Off to plot and storm off all on one turn, and then prevents your Slickshot Show-Off from getting chump blocked by a 1/1 flyer. And we're also tweaking the lands, so dropping the Battlefield Forge and the 2 Inspiring Vantages and 1 Plains to bring in sort of the cheaper options, right? The budget options. So the Abraded Bluffs, dealing the 1 damage to your opponent as a tap land. The Rockish Carnival, which is, if you damage them quickly enough, this can actually enter just untapped. But it's also a common budget land. And then 1 copy of the Rockface Village. And sometimes we see this one included, sometimes not, because again, this one is dropping a little bit off of the mouse synergies, and it doesn't have the lizard in mono red that I'm blanking on, Hired Claw. So anyway, some budget options for you if you don't want to spend the wild cards on the rares. And this strategy is favored against mono red aggro. It's favored against Dimir Midrange and Golgari Midrange. And it's weak to the mono black midrange. So both of the top 2 performing strategies are weak to the mono black single point interaction. And the opening hand is Heartfire Hero and the Sheltered by Ghosts, being a particularly good turn 1, turn 2. Because you attack in as a 3/2 lifelink ward that, protects your Heartfire Hero from your single point interaction of your opponent. And then we have the Optimistic Scavenger. If you are running that version that's running more towards like the Boros Auras, that's another one that works particularly well in your opening hand. All right, number 3 in Tier 1 and the last deck in Tier 1 is Boros Auras. And this is the one that I've been using to hit into high numbered Mythic. It kind of depends on, again, how much mono black you're bumping into. Kind of have to select what you're experiencing on the ladder. So this one, we can see this week they dropped kind of the explorations, right? So the Cheeky House Mouse or the Squeak By got cut. The Kellen Planar Trailblazer is cut, as well as the 2 copies of the Screaming Nemesis, which we're starting to see Screaming Nemesis pop into other archetypes instead of just the mono red archetype that we had from Worlds. This one is bringing in the 3 copies of the Monastery Swiftspear. This one kind of comes and goes throughout the weeks. The upside to running the Monastery Swiftspears is to have more bodies for your auras. And then we're dropping 1 Feather of Flight and bringing in the 3 Demonic Ruckus. And the 3 Demonic Ruckus, again, fits into the enchantment theme and helps get around. Giving your creature menace helps if there's more go wide strategies, which we are starting to see pop up a little bit more with like Jeskai Convoke, Boros Convoke, and Selesnya Rabbits, which we'll talk about here shortly. And then we're dropping a Plains and a Rockface Village to bring in an additional copy of the Thran Portal. And especially with the life gain off of the Sheltered by Ghosts, the Thran Portal is not particularly bad. It's favored against mono red aggro and Golgari Midrange. It's a coin flip against Dimir Midrange, and it's weak to mono black midrange and Azorius Control. And same with the Mardu Aggro list. If it's more like the Boros Auras, the counter to the Boros Auras strategy is something like Temporary Lockdown, where you're able to not target the creature but still kill the creature, or effectively kill the creature, exile the creature. And this one is the same as the Mardu Aggro strategy. You're looking to have Heartfire Hero, the Sheltered by Ghosts, and the Optimistic Scavenger in your opening hand is pretty ideal. All right, now at the top of tier 2, talking about the go wide strategies to punish the mono black that then is countering the top 2 strategies that I just talked about, Jeskai Convoke. So this one has had no changes since we talked about it last week, and it's still relatively new. It's not a very popular deck, although it has been performing reasonably well. Tier 2 is very viable to take to Mythic. The matchups for this, though, just going off of before rotation, when it was a 2-color deck instead of a 3-color deck, usually Boros Convoke or Jeskai Convoke is weak against the mono red. The aggro strategies where you need some sort of instant speed interaction against your opponent, this deck does not have. But where it does do quite well is against single point interaction. And the Knight Errant of Eos is largely the reason for that, as well as just the general like 1-drops that your opponent doesn't want to use, like a Go for the Throat and trade down in value on. But yeah, you're trying to create your opening hand is the Gleeful Demolition, and then any of your targets, right? Like the Clockwork Percussionist, Spyglass Siren, Novice Inspector. Because the whole point of this deck is it plays more like an aggro combo deck where you're trying to hit a turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos. So this one, if you have the Gleeful Demolition, is particularly nice to have in your opening hand. Because then you can turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos, hit an Imidane's Recruiter off of the draw from the Knight Errant of Eos, and play a turn 3 Imidane's Recruiter. And that's the general strategy for this deck. Number 5 is Rakdos Aggro, and this one's also in tier 2, and we see a couple of changes. So coming back to the Emberheart Challengers, coming back into this list, I personally like the Emberheart Challenger in Rakdos Aggro, but it's not necessary, and we do see it dropped some weeks. We're dropping the 4 copies of the Might of the Meek, which is the +1/+1 and trample and card draw for 1 red, which is nice for kind of cheaply popping off with your Slick Shot Show Off. We're dropping 2 copies of Shock, which was included in this archetype to kind of give a little bit of a non-linear or interaction, a non-linear strategy against your opponent's stuff. And I like just taking it out because this is the more pure aggro deck than the mono red version, which is more of a disruptive aggro strategy, like I talked about in my deck types video. So the advantage to this strategy is that you can go faster than mono red. So we're bringing back in the 4 copies of the Dreadmaw's Ire. The 2 power toughness combat tricks work particularly well with the turn 3 win off of Slick Shot Show Off, because if you can get this to power 9, when you fling it, it deals 11 damage, so 20 damage total. So you need 2 combat spells that pump for 2, like the Felonious Rage or the Dreadmaw's Ire. And the trample is helpful for getting over problematic blockers. We're bringing in a 4th copy of the Mirren Bane Splitter. This one works particularly well with some of your 1-drops like Heartfire Hero and Cacophony Scamp, giving you that damage the turn that you play it, but then also if they have to kill your creature later with mono black, like Go for the Throat, then the Bane Splitter kind of works particularly well to hit them twice, right? And then it gives something, if you are flooding out, to kind of do with your mana. This deck doesn't do particularly well if it floods. So we're dropping the Demonic Ruckus, which sometimes gets paired with the Slick Shot Show Off, like it in Mardu Aggro. And we're dropping the 7 Mountains to bring in the Black Lands of the Black Cleave Cliffs and the Sulphurous Springs. And as somebody in my community pointed out last week, the downside to bringing in the Black Lands is that it kind of forecasts and lets your opponent know that you are running the Callous Sellsword version, because mono red isn't always running that card, right? But if we see a Black Land, then they can kind of prepare for that. So that's the downside. The upside is that you get to play the black side of Callous Sellsword, and I think that the more straightforward that you're just trying to like shoot your opponent with the Slick Shot Show Off for the 20 damage to face, the Callous Sellsword comes out more often when you're blowing up your own Scamp to get a 2-for-1, and then you're playing out a large creature, right? So it depends on the matchup, right? And it depends on the play style and how you're approaching the deck. But bringing in the black does let you play an alternative strategy that you really don't need. It's not necessary. It just has pros and cons like everything. So the matchups for this one, it's favored against mono red aggro, and that's really the perk of this, is that it's faster, right? It's a coin flip against Dimir Midrange, similar to the other strategies with mono red, that it kind of depends on how Dimir Midrange is drawing its removal. It's weak against mono black midrange, which has a lot of ways to disrupt the one-turn kill. And then it's also weak to the Boros Auras strategy because it doesn't do particularly well if your opponent gets out of range of the one-turn kill by flinging your Slickshot Show-Off. So the lifelink can quickly get you out of get the Rakdos Aggro strategy in trouble. So the opening hand for this one is the Heartfire Hero and the Manifold Mouse if you are running the Manifold Mouse. Otherwise, you're looking for something like the Monstrous Rage and the Monastery Swift Spear. Some sort of easy, starts on turn 1, pressures your opponent, has some line to the turn 3 or the turn 4 win. And number 6 in tier 2 is Selesnya Rabbits. And still not seeing Sheltered by Ghosts in this archetype. I was wondering if we were going to see it because I personally think it helps out against mono red, which this deck can struggle with. But we do see 0 changes in the main, only changes happening to the lands. So this is the less budget version of the lands. So we're dropping the 3 forests and the 4 plains to bring in the 1 copy of the Brushland and the 2 Cavern of Souls and 1 additional Lupine Flower Village and 3 Razor Verge Thicket. So the deck can work with just the basics, but if you have them, I do think they add a slight edge to have the more expensive lands. So this deck is similar to the Jeskai Convoke, or the Boros Convoke is punishing the single point interaction in black, and mono black, part of the reason why mono black hasn't been making it into the top 8 is because of strategies like this, right? So it's favored against mono black midrange, it's favored against Dimir midrange, and it's favored against Golgari midrange, any of the decks leaning on that single point interaction. And then it's weak against mono red aggro and Boros Auras, lacking the instant speed interaction to slow down and disrupt those strategies, and those strategies are a turn faster than what this one is doing. But the single point interaction, similar to the Jeskai Convoke, is getting punished by the Knight Errant of Eos. So in this hand, or in this deck, it's less of a combo deck off of the Knight Errant of Eos. This is more of like a boon. And really the crux, or the cornerstone of this deck is Valley Might Caller. And you can also start with the Pop Hatch Recruit, is a particularly nice one to play to then prevent the single point interaction on your Valley Might Caller. And it also, you can play it for its offspring on 3. So there's some good flexibility for having this one in your opening hand as well. So when I'm playing Selesnya Rabbits, these 2 are the cards that I'm generally looking for in my opening hand. All right, and for those of you who have listened to my ramblings every week and are desperately waiting for a new archetype, we've got one this week. It's Mono Red Goblins. And a couple of weeks ago, I did my own version of Mono Red Goblins, and the introduction of the Rundvelt Horde Master is really why there's like more, well, and the Seer Slicer Goblin, right? Like we got some interesting tools that have kind of made the mono red goblins more viable, because I guess we actually had this one back in DMU. Anyway, this version is running the Urbresk's Forge and the Agatha's Soul Cauldron and the Krenko. I decided to cut it from my version. I did have them in the sideboard as a nod that they have been performing well in some matchups, and less so in others. So, but the nice thing about the Krenko is that it's an activated ability, so it works with the Agatha's Soul Cauldron, being able to put a +1/+1 counter on something, and then allows it to tap to create X 1/1 goblins, and then you can just keep moving those counters around and create a whole bunch of goblins. And I think there's also a little bit of the yeah, so it's not running both lords, so that we have other goblins you control get +1/+1 in the drop kicker, and that one was the one that I decided to run. But anyway, you've got this kind of go wide strategy that you're then using Goblin Surprise to pump the board, or using Goblin Surprise to just create 1/1s. Squee is also creating 1/1s every time that it attacks, and then I think I dropped the Lightning Strike. I have to go back and remember. I can't remember off the top of my head, but yeah, just a ton of pressure. Frenzied Goblin can make it so your opponent can't block. The Fanatical Firebrand is particularly nice for like tapping and blowing up to kill the Optimistic Scavenger and the Heartfire Hero in Boros Auras. Same with like the Cacophony Scamp. This can be a really problematic one for your opponent to deal with. I pumped this one up to 4 copies though, instead of just the 1. But that is partly because I was running the Double Lord. And again, I try to remove my bias. So when it comes to a deck that I've spent some time on though, I always try to throw my own insight in there, right? So this one's new on, it's new to the Foundation's meta, and we're seeing it a little bit more here and there. It's still kind of an unpopular pick, if you will. But the opening hand, you're looking for your turn 1 goblins, so like your Cacophony Scamp works particularly well. The Squee is one of the more powerful cards in the archetype, in my opinion, as well as the Horde Master, having the Lord in your hand. The Seer Slicer Goblin is also particularly good to have in your opening hand, and then your Reckless Lackey. Like both of your 1-drop goblins that attack well, enabling you to do your raid with the Seer Slicer Goblin, is really how this deck kind of just gets off to too fast of a start for your opponent to deal with. All right, and then number 8 in tier 2 is Mono White Lifegain. This is another archetype that I did my own build on. I also talked about a meta breaker that I found yesterday that was 1 card different than the version that I built. So I have my own bias on this archetype specifically. But this one is going closer, I guess, to the one that I built. So last week we talked about the one that had Cat Collector and the Enduring Innocence to kind of, whenever you gain life, create a 1/1 that then triggers the card draw off of the Enduring Innocence. And it was also running like 2 copies of the Lorn of the Third Path. So we're dropping all of those, and we're going for the Knight Errant of Eos, which, similar to the Boros Convoke, kind of punishes the single point interaction, and I think improves the matchup against mono black, which this deck can kind of struggle with without the Knight Errant of Eos. So we're bringing in the 4 copies of the Leonin Vanguard. This gaining life on your turn pre-combat is particularly nice with the Pridemate and the Essence Channeler, so that they can get pumped up for additional damage. And we're also running the 4 copies of Linden, the Steadfast Queen. This is a card that I haven't, in all honesty, I haven't explored yet. It hasn't impressed me, but part of it was because I was bringing in Fountain Port to be able to give Essence Channeler the flying and vigilance on our turn by paying 1 life to create the token, right? Sometimes that's like a way that you can kind of get your damage through. And because these decks, as these get really big, these are just prone to getting like chump blocked, right? So if you aren't going to run the Fountain Port, then I like the Linden, the Steadfast Queen, just because of the triple pip white. You don't want those colorless sources. So the upside to this, though, is that the creatures are going to get pumped as you're attacking and can kind of help the Pridemate and the Essence Channeler get super big, right? So we're dropping the Case of the Uneaten Feast. Again, that's one that I don't really like, and I'm happy to see gone. Leyline of Hope, I'm happy to see back, and at 4 copies. And like I mentioned, we're dropping the Fountain Port and playing just 2 planes instead. So if you do bring in the Fountain Ports, I think it's wise to increase the land count to 22 instead of just 20, since the Fountain Port itself is kind of expensive to activate. But the whole point of this deck is to punish mono red and Dimir Midrange. Anything that is kind of trying to get its damage in quickly, but then kind of runs out of gas, then this deck punishes. And then it's weak to mono black midrange. Again, kind of depends on the build, because the Knight Errant of Eos does help the matchup against mono black midrange. But if your early enablers like your Healer's Hawk and your Runelurker Bat and your Leonin Vanguard and whatnot, if they get sniped by Cut Down and then your Pridemate and your Essence Channeler get killed by Go for the Throat, this deck can struggle to actually get the Knight Errant of Eos to kind of pop off, right? So keep that in mind if you are up against a mono black opponent. And yeah. So if you're on the draw and you see a black land, you may want to wait to kind of burst out your hand a little bit more. Just something to consider. So the opening hand for this deck is Leyline of Hope. Obviously, Leylines are better in your opening hand. The Leonin Vanguard has been particularly impressive early on in the game, and then a little bit less so as the game continues. And same with the Hinterland Sanctifier. So both of these are particularly nice to have in your opening hand. All right, and now we're going to talk about best of 3. So for best of 3, I like to use the standard challenge, which is a tournament on Magic the Gathering Online. and it tends to be a little bit faster. It tends to, sorry, the untapped tracker tends to echo what is happening in the standard showcase or the standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online. And part of it is because everybody sees those tournaments and then goes and plays it on Arena. And so I figure, if it achieves the same goal to follow what's happening on the standard challenge. So, and you see some really great Magic the Gathering players. I mean, like Ariane made it into the top this week. Rim F is a really great Dimir Midrange player that we've seen throughout the weeks. So anyway, it's still a nice way to do it. I hope I don't have to convince you too much. So first place on the 20th was Dimir Midrange by Rasta F, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about the nitty-gritty details of each card and why it was selected, as well as the best of 3 sideboard options. For those of you who are potentially prepping for like an RCQ, I would like to try to give you as much knowledge as I can. So I'll do my best, right? So this week what we see in Rasta F's approach to Dimir Midrange is that they tweaked it to be better against the mono red or the Boros Prowess or the Boros Prowess kind of versions, and I'll point out where, right? So we're bringing in the 2 copies of the Preacher of the Schism. This one is worse off against the matchups where the tempo is important. So it's better when you're trying to slow a faster deck down rather than the punishing of a control deck, right? So as I've talked about in my deck types video, midrange tends to try to play like a control deck against aggro and then play like an aggro deck against control, right? Try to get under control and go over aggro. So Preacher of the Schism, particularly good at punishing red. And we also see one less Anoint with Affliction. This one kind of just depends on the targets in the meta and whether or not you have something that is particularly annoying, like the Unstoppable Slasher that needs to be exiled. Works well against the Golgari Midrange for the Mosswood Dread Knight as well. This version is not running the Fey Balloon trick, and that one is, again, better at going faster than it is slowing things down. Shieldred's Edict we're dropping by 1. This one I think has more so to do with like the ward off of Sheltered by Ghosts, but also whether or not you're bumping into the mirror on Dimir Midrange to get rid of the Kaido. And we're bringing in the Go for the Throat and bringing in a Nowhere to Run. So Nowhere to Run gets through the Snakeskin Veil in Boros Prowess, and is another one that you like to usually bring in against aggro matchups. So we're also dropping 1 Restless Reef, which is better against the control matchups, and then we're bringing in 1 Swamp. So the best of 3 sideboard is tweaked a little bit from last week when we talked about it too. So we're dropping the Akhlazot's Deepest Betrayal. That one was just kind of like, it was a popular pick back a ways as a way to kind of bring it, a card to bring in against mono red and other Dimir midrange matchups. And we're dropping 1 Ghost Vacuum, which again also works well against other Dimir midrange matchups. So we're seeing a couple of things that are kind of like slight nods to there being less Dimir midrange anticipated by Rasta F. And then we're moving the 3 copies of the Preacher of the Schism from the sideboard largely to the main, but we do have another copy here in the sideboard. And then we've moved the Anoint with Affliction from the main to the sideboard, so we can still bring that in if we are up against something that's advantageous to have the exile. We're bringing in the Blot Out, which is another card that's particularly good against mono red to be able to get rid of the Screaming Nemesis. It also works well in the matchup, the mirror match, to get rid of the Enduring Curiosity. And we're bringing in the 1 copy of Disfigure, which works really well for Heartfire Hero and Cacophony Scamp, so that you're not like getting hit by its death trigger. We also have the Malicious Eclipse, and this one is kind of a nod to there being a little bit more of the Jeskai Convoke strategies and the Go Wide strategies. And we're bringing in an additional copy of Negate, as well as 1 additional copy of Shieldred the Apocalypse. All right, and number 2 on the 20th was Domain by Ariane. And so this is kind of the most current version of Domain, is leaning a little bit more heavily into the Zur Eternal Schemer side of things than we've seen in the past. And as some people call it the Overlord's deck, because there are versions of Domain that aren't really leaning fully into the enchantment Reanimate with Zur strategy. So we see this week that they're dropping the Overlord of the Flood Pits and 1 Zur Eternal Schemer to bring in Atraxa, Grand Unifier, and dropping 1 copy of Split Up and bringing in a Day of Judgment. So it's not uncommon for this deck to have several different Wraths, and the Split Up is being explored over the Temporary Lockdown, has, depending on the matchups, has some pros and cons, right? So bringing in the Day of Judgment here instead of the Split Up, basically, and then bringing back the 1 copy of Herd Migration. So we've seen Herd Migration dropped from a lot of lists. It works particularly well with the domain token everywhere that you get off of the Overlord of the Hauntwoods, and because it immediately gives you the domain. But it's not super great against other domain decks that have the white sweepers, and but it does give you some life stabilization, so kind of helps you up against the aggro matchups. And let's see, we're dropping 1 Get Lost to bring in 1 copy of the Scroll Shift. This is another one that we've seen kind of explored throughout the weeks, because you can exile your enchantment and then have it return as its full side without any impending. So it's a way to kind of cheese these further, just like Zur Eternal Schemer. And then for the lands, we're dropping a Cavern of Souls, two Lush Porticos, and 2 Plains to bring in 1 Fabled Passage, 1 Hushwood. Where's the Hushwood? Hushwood Verge. 1 additional copy of the Restless Anchorage to have the Manland, and then 1 Underground Mortuary. And the best of 3 sideboard also got a little bit of a tweak here. So we're dropping 1 copy of the Authority of the Consuls. So Ariane decided that 4 was a little overkill and that 3 was enough. And I kind of like that, because like if you have multiple Authority of the Consuls in your opening hand, it can be awkward. Because like you do get additional life, but your stuff is already entering tapped, so can be awkward if you have multiples. So the negates we're dropping from the list, which I thought was very surprising, because the negates are particularly nice in some matchups. And again, if you want the full in-depth strategy, I do try to post sideboard guides in the community tab. So we're dropping 1 Nissa Ascended Animist and bringing in the 2 Terra Sunders. Getting rid of the 2 Terra Sunders. So last week we saw kind of a spike in domain, and so having the Nissa and the Terra Sunders as well, and the Tranquil Frillback, which also got cut, gives you a whole bunch of enchantment hate to then fight your opponent's ley lines and such, right? So leaning further away from that. And then bringing in Beza the Bounding Spring. Again, this one is a stabilizing force against aggro. And then Doppelgang gives you an alternative strategy. If your enchantments and Zur is kind of falling behind, you can then just win off of sheer mana advantage with the Doppelgang. And we're also bringing in 2 copies of Jace the Perfected Mind. And I kind of like this approach, because Jace the Perfected Mind is a great way to win in the mirror match. This has been a classic one to bring in against the other domain, where you're kind of trading blows with one another. You can then punish especially the Atraxa version. I actually haven't tried Jace against the Overlord strategy, because it's been a little while since I've messed around with domain in best of 3, to be honest. But anyway, the Jace the Perfected Mind gives you the mill win as a potential out. And then we have 2 copies of the Temporary Lockdown. If you're coming up against like Girl Prowess, the fast aggro decks with small little tiny creatures, then you can bring in the Temporary Lockdown. All right, first place on the 21st was Golgari Midrange by Tuchuko, and we see kind of a return back to the Golgari Demons build, if you will. So we're dropping the 1 copy of Shielder of the Apocalypse and 1 copy of Thrun, Breaker of Silence, to bring in the 2 copies of the Archfiend of the Dross, as well as 1 copy of the Sentinel of the Nameless City. This one helps stabilize against aggro. And then the upside of the Archfiend of the Dross too is punishing mono red, which can have a difficult time removing the 6/6 flyer. And we're dropping the 2 Gix's Command and the 1 Blot Out, 1 Terra Sunder, and 1 The End, which are all kind of just these little one-ofs that were being explored last week. And we're bringing back in the 4 copies of the Unholy Annex. which work particularly well with like Soulstone Sanctuary and gives you the card advantage as well as creating your own flyer. The best of 3 sideboard, we're dropping 1 Duress, 3 copies of Harvester of Misery, 1 Nissa Ascended Animist, and 1 Tranquil Frillback, and bringing in the 2 copies of the Choking Miasma. This one's particularly nice whenever you're in Golgari to use the sweeper. I like it. And the Ghost Vacuum. This one, again, remember this can get rid of Enduring threats, so Enduring Innocence, Enduring Curiosity, and Dimir Midrange, Endearing whatever the green one's called, Vitality, I think. In Temur Otters, anything that goes to the graveyard and then returns, you can snag it before it returns. Gix's Command in the sideboard instead of in the main. Again, you're gonna pick this one against. You're gonna pick these. This one's a nice one because of the +1/+1 and lifelink against the aggro matchups, as well as anything that has a whole bunch of power 2 or less. So if they have like a go wide strategy, Gix's Command is particularly nice for punishing that strategy. And we also have the Terra Sunders for domain, anything with an enchantment heavy strategy. And then the Vivian Reed works particularly well against the Unholy Annex decks because it destroys enchantments or creatures with flying, and then is kind of a win condition of itself that gets around the mono white board sweepers. All right, number 2 on the 21st was Boros Prowess by Jarvis Me, and we're seeing a little bit more of a return to mono red, and then kind of like what we saw a couple of weeks ago where the mono red deck was bringing in green lands so that you could bring in green cards like Patchwork Formation in the sideboard. This one is doing that, except for bringing in white cards, but the idea is the same. Being able to play mono red, but with the possibility of destroying problematic enchantments like Authority of the Consuls, right? So we're dropping a little bit more of the Boros side of things and going strictly to mono red. So we're seeing Mabel get dropped. We're bringing in the 3 copies of the Monastery Swiftspear, as well as the 2 copies of the Screaming Nemesis. We're dropping the 2 copies of the Boros Charm, as well as the Lightning Helix to bring in the Lightning Strikes, and the Witchstalker Frenzies. And remember, Witchstalker Frenzy pairs well with Screaming Nemesis because you can shoot it, and so you can pop your opponent for 5 damage. And we're dropping the Shardsmaid's Rescue and the Sheltered by Ghosts, and then tweaking the lands a little bit, dropping the Plains and the Rockish Carnival and the Restless Bivouac to just bring in mountains and an additional Rockface Village. So really mono red with the capability of sideboarding into white. And I think it's an interesting approach. I kind of like it. So we're also tweaking the sideboard a little bit. So we're dropping the Exercise, we're dropping the 2 copies of Rest in Peace, and we're bringing the Screaming Nemesis from the sideboard into the main. We're dropping 1 copy of Torch the Tower, which is really good against the other the other aggro matchups. And instead, we're bringing in additional copies of Lithomantic Barrage. And so this one is good against any deck that's running white or blue. It's particularly nice against Zur, but the downside is that it's sorcery speed. So if they bring it in and immediately hit you with the lifelink, it's the downside to the Lithomantic Barrage. But it's a cheap, good removal for white and blue. It's good against Azorius Oculus and the like as well. And we're also seeing 3 Sheltered by Ghosts in the sideboard. And this one is good if your opponent struggles with the lifelink strategy and doesn't have a way to get around. It's better against red than it is against black, right? Because black has the Shieldred's Edict and the Nowhere to Run. So if you can, yeah, good for punishing certain strategies. So this was a really good week for Dimir Midrange, and we've seen several weeks ago 4 copies of Dimir Midrange made it into the top 8 for the week as well. So and by that I mean winning first place or second place in one of the tournaments during the week. So we're going to be talking about Dimir Midrange a fair amount today, and so I hope you're down for that. So there's number 1 on the 21st, because there's 2 tournaments on the 21st. This one was Dimir Midrange by Falcon, and this one's a little bit more similar to the one that we covered last week. So we're dropping the Anoint with the Affliction and the Shieldred's Edict, and running the Go for the Throat and the Nowhere to Run. And again, largely because we're seeing more of the Heartfire Hero kind of strategies to have the Nowhere to Run. We're also dropping the Restless Reef to bring in the Swamp, and that was the same change that we saw in the other list as well, kind of indicating as well that the man lands are less important, man lands being more important in the control matchup, less important in the aggro matchup. And the best of 3 sideboard also got a rework, so we dropped the Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal, the Ghost Vacuum, the 2 Preachers of the Schism, and 1 Tishana's Tidebinder to bring in an additional copy of Anoint with Affliction and 1 additional copy of Blot Out, and then the Disfigure. So similar sideboard changes to what we covered in the other list. This one is bringing in Neutralize the Guards, though, which is a new one that I haven't really seen played a bunch. It's an instant speed, -1/-1, instead of sorcery speed, and so it's good as long as your opponent hasn't been able to really build the board outside of the 1 toughness, but we don't see that as much as we used to, right? So being able to actually just wipe everything for -1/-1 I think will work relatively well, and then you come with the upside of having the Surveil 2. So depending on when you play this, it can give you a little bit better card advantage as long as you aren't needing the -2/-2 effect, right? So kind of a curious one to see there. And then we have an additional copy of Shieldred the Apocalypse, and this one's also a good tool that you would bring in against aggro. And this one went in a very different direction. This one's almost more of a Dimir Demons kind of build because it's bringing in the Unholy Annex, right? So we're dropping Kaido, Bane of Nightmares entirely, the Enduring Curiosity, the Flood Pit's Drowner, and the Spyglass Siren, which, you know, at this, you can't even really call this Dimir Midrange with that many changes to the typical curve out, right? But I'm sure it caught some people off guard. So we're bringing in Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal in the main, and we're also bringing in Urtai Resurrected, which works really well with the Fairy Mastermind to be able to counterspell or kill something, and then the Fairy Mastermind offsets kind of the advantage off of the card draw, and especially if you're punishing their card draw with a card like Shieldred the Apocalypse. We're running 3 copies of Preacher of the Schism in the main. Again, better when the aggro matchups are expected. And then running a 1 Gix's Command, dropping the Feybloom Tricks, and the 2 Shieldred's Edict for Go for the Throat, and 2 more copies of Go for the Throat, and 2 Spell Stutters. So really leaning more heavily into the counter spells than we've seen in some weeks. And then we're also bringing in 1 copy of the End, and we've seen this one kind of throughout the weeks as well. This one's particularly good against combo decks like the Zur, the Enchanter deck, or the Flood Caller deck in Temur. Anything that has a specific combo piece that, you know, the deck can struggle with a little bit, the End is able to remove all of their copies. And we're bringing in 1 copy of 3 Steps Ahead. This one, again, if you look at the community tab for the Dimir sideboard guide, you can kind of get an idea of where 3 Steps Ahead is good. I think it was included in that one. There's so many different variations of Dimir Midrange. It can be a little tricky to do a sideboard guide. So I also included a second one in the list that I was exploring that kind of showcases you some alternative options. But the 3 Steps Ahead tends to be a card that's better the longer the game is going, as opposed to shorter. And I lost my spot. Okay, yeah. And then we're bringing in the 4 copies of the Unholy Annex. And no other demon synergies, though. We're not bringing in any of the Archfiends or anything like that. So just Unholy Annex by itself, which we've seen throughout the weeks as well. We're dropping 4 islands and a Restless Reef to bring in a Soulstone Sanctuary. So we're bringing all the way up to 4, which helps kind of give the deck more demons, because this is a shapeshifter, gives you all creature types, works with the Unholy Annex. We're also adding in a Swamp and 4 Undercity Sewers. So the best of 3 sideboard, dropping Aklazot's Deepest Betrayal and the 2 copies of Gix's Command, as well as all 4 copies of the Preacher of the Schism, moving the Aklazot's and the Preacher of the Schism to the main, same with Shieldred the Apocalypse. We're dropping Tishana's Tidebinder, so across the board we're seeing less Tishana's Tidebinder, and I think that's because there was less Unholy Annex the week before, and now we're seeing more Unholy Annex coming back. And it's not like it's the perfect target, because it is an enchantment, and Tishana's Tidebinder hits artifacts, creatures, or planeswalkers, but when they spend 5 and then you counter their 5/5, and it's not like they can open it up again, right? So you can kind of wipe at least the right side of it with the Tishana's Tidebinder. Blot Out, bringing that one in, as I've mentioned before, it's good against the like the Enduring Curiosities and such that this deck is not running. Bringing in the 2 copies of Disdainful Stroke. This one you typically see being brought in against Domain because the impending enchantments count as mana value 5 or 6. So you can then use Disdainful Stroke against them. It also helps you protect your board against cards like Sunfall. But it's not as limited to negate, which then has to be a non-creature spell. So this still works in certain circumstances, just for different matchups. They have pros and cons. And Ghost Vacuum, again, this one's good against Azorius Oculus, any Reanimator strategies, but also don't forget that it's a good answer to Enduring Blanks. And then 2 copies of Liliana the Veil. This helps out against control matchups. Being able to make them discard is particularly good against the more controlling matchups, because this is kind of very set up for against aggro. Then this you can sideboard in to be better against the controlling. And then we're dropping the we're adding in the Malicious Eclipse, and this is kind of what I was talking about with the difference between the -1/-1 at instant speed. This one's the -2/-2, but you're going to bring this in against the board flood strategies of Jeskai Convoke, mono white tokens, and then potentially against Heartfire Hero in Boros Prowess and Gruul Prowess. And we're running an additional copy of Negate, good against the control matchups that are, have a high non-creature spell count, and then 1 additional Nowhere to Run. And I kind of like Nowhere to Run being in the sideboard, and then you bring it in. It really depends on how much you're anticipating mono red. But anyway, bringing that one in when it's advantaged to do so. All right, now to the 4th version of Dimir Midrange this week by Daniel Akos. Took down number 1 on December 22nd, which is the big tournament on Sunday. And this one, a little bit more like your traditional Dimir midrange. We're actually seeing a throwback to Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, which we haven't seen for a little bit. So we're dropping Kaido down to 3 copies, which was more common earlier on. 4 has been preferred now for a little bit for the additional pressure of being able to ninjutsu this in early. Enduring Curiosity dropped 1, and then 1 Flood Pit's Drowner dropped 1. Again, if you go in and you look at my sideboard guide, you can kind of see where the Flood Pit's Drowner is not very advantageous with things like mono white control. And then dropping 1 to Shauna's Tidebinder to bring in the 3 copies of the Deep Cavern Bat. And this one used to be a staple in Dimir midrange and then kind of got dropped as we went further on into Foundations. So going back to the Deep Cavern Bat, and this really, I think, you see Deep Cavern Bat requires your opponent to play some sort of 1-costed answer. So when we see Cut Down being run as 4 copies, the Deep Cavern Bat becomes worse, and that's when you I think that as people moved away from the Deep Cavern Bat, they've started to cheese out a little bit on the single point interaction, and then you can kind of bring it back in to punish that. So it depends on how much you think people are playing the 4th copy of the Cut Down in the side. Urtai Resurrected, though, coming in this week as well, similar to what we saw before in the alternative Dimir midrange strategy. Mockingbird is another one that we've seen kind of come and go throughout the week, so just running a 1 of there. And then 1 Shieldred the Apocalypse in the main. Again, depends on how much aggro. It also is a way to punish other Dimir midrange decks for having the Enduring Curiosity or the Gix. And we're dropping Anoint with Affliction and the Fabloon Trick. So Fabloon Trick kind of across the board, not really making it this week. It did make it into 1 version, but not the other 3, if I remember correctly. And I don't know. I didn't get to explore the Fabloon Trick as in depth as I'd like. It is an interesting one to do at the end of your opponent's turn on turn 3, and then Enduring Curiosity on turn 4 to draw 2 cards. So it's a very aggressive. It's probably play versus draw dependent, and maybe that's why we're seeing it cut here. So again, I lost my spot. Apologize. Oh yeah, Shieldred's Edict got cut, and we're dropping the 2 copies of the Spell Stutter, and instead we're running the Go for the Throat and the 2 copies of Phantom Interference. And so again, this one kind of typical, you either run the Spell Stutter, which has the fairy synergies, or you run the Phantom Interference, and it kind of depends on what your opponent's anticipating, right? We're dropping the Restless Reef as well, and one Soulstone Sanctuary to bring in a Fountain Port, and one Swamp, which that one was a little bit, I was like, oh, well, but it does allow you to like sacrifice the Spyglass Siren map tokens to draw, and yeah, it just kind of gives you an alternative resource if the game is going along. But yeah, that's right. This version is running the Fabloom Tricks in the sideboard, which I think I like because of being you able to control it. You can bring it in on the matchups that you like to have the Fabloom Trick, but you can also bring it in when you're on the play instead of when you're on the draw, right? So because like it's just defensively less powerful of a card to play 2 1/1 flyers for 3. There's some matchups where you definitely don't want to do it, right? So I like it as a sideboard card, and I'll be curious to see if that's where it stays. This one's also dropping Acklezot's Deepest Betrayal, so no one really favoring that one as a sideboard this week. We're dropping the Ghost Vacuum, and we're dropping the Gix's Command, and one Preacher of the Schism. So we still have 3 Preacher of the Schisms, but not a full playset. We're also dropping one Shieldred the Apocalypse, because we brought it into the main. And we're bringing the Anoint with Affliction into the sideboard, which was kind of a decision that was supported by, I think, all 4. We're running the Anoint with Affliction in the side instead of in the main. And then we're running the 2 copies of the Fabloom Trick in the sideboard. As I mentioned, bring this in when you feel like it is advantageous to do so. And then the Glistening Deluge. This one is kind of an alternative to the -2/-2, being able to specifically give -3/-3 to creatures that are green and or white. So otherwise it's a -1/-1. So it's like it's a worse sweeper against red and better up against the mono white tokens, right? So kind of a matchup specific sweeper. And then negate, bringing in a 2nd copy, and then 1 Withering Torment. This is the kind of card that you'd want to bring in against the Domain Zur enchantments heavy deck, but you could also bring it in against the Unholy Annex, and you could also bring it in against the Caretaker's Talent in mono white control, just basically if they have a problematic enchantment that you want to destroy. All right, and last but not least is a quote new archetype. Boros Mice has been around for a little bit, but we haven't talked about it in the top 2 in the standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online for the 6 weeks of Foundations. And it's one that, people have explored in Best of 1 as well. And, the advantage to running this over the mono red is the life gain. So it changes the matchups a little bit if you're also up against another aggro matchup. So we've got Mabel, Heir to Cragflame, which we've seen explored in Best of 1 as well. The equipment allows you to trigger the Valiant of your Heartfire Hero and your Emberheart Challenger. So there's some nice synergies there, as well as just being a Mouse Lord that increases the power of those 2 cards. So you're leaning a little bit more heavily into that archetype, or into that strategy. It's sort of bringing in aspects of Boros Auras from Best of 1, as well as aspects of Boros Burn. So we've got the Lightning Helix, which can, the life gain can offset if you're in a race. Sheltered by Ghosts, as we've seen, punishes some strategies quite heavily. Monstrous Rage, Hard Claw, and the Screaming Nemesis from the mono red side of things. The Burst Lightning. We've got the Shard Mage's Rescue to protect the target that you're trying to enchant with your Sheltered by Ghosts. And then we have the Flowerfoot Swordmaster, which is kind of reserved only for the Boros, for the mouse strategy. I haven't really seen this one a whole lot. Oh, I forgot. So this is Boros Mice by IP Band. Went number 2 on, took 2nd place on the 22nd. So very similar to the strategies that we're seeing in Best of 1, which I hope my explanation of that archetype explained it well enough. Wasn't my best, I'll admit. And then we see the exercise version. So this sideboard is almost more similar to what we saw in the Boros Prowess deck that I covered last week. So we have the 4 copies of the Destroy Evil as well as the 1 copy of Exercise to give you that enchantment hate in the sideboard. We also have 2 additional copies of Screaming Nemesis that we can bring into the main if we're up against another mono red deck. Because if they only have damage-based removal, Screaming Nemesis is a particularly pain to remove because it's usually resulting in a 2-for-1. It's less good if you're coming up against a whole bunch of go for the throats, right? And that's another reason why we see kind of across the board in Dimir Midrange and whatnot, people leaning into those go for the throats, right? So the Torch the Tower, again, better in the other aggro matchups, Dimir Midrange, anything that has something demanding the quick interaction to punish or prevent complete and utter destruction. And we have the Urbrask's Forge. So this one, you're going to bring this one in against black. You're not going to bring this in against green or white. So green and white are better at destroying artifacts, whereas black has to rely on duress or snagging it from your hand. So generally, you're going to bring in the Urbrask's Forge against the black mid-range strategies. You can also bring it in against other aggro strategies. So I know some people like to bring it in against mono red aggro and like Dimir Midrange, and just any deck that kind of struggles to answer it that isn't running the Destroy Evils, the Exercise that has the upside of being able to destroy the artifact. And Witchstalker Frenzy, then also if you're going to bring in the 4 copies of the Screaming Nemesis, the Witchstalker Frenzy with the full playset of the Screaming Nemesis allows you to have that line, as well as getting rid of 5 toughness problematic blockers like Shieldred the Apocalypse. So, hope my ramblings have found you well. I went a little bit over this week, just lots to talk about, and was kind of, just rambly today. I try to keep it around 45 minutes usually, but overshot, so I apologize. With that though, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody who's joined me this year. This year my YouTube has absolutely blown up from the years before, and so that always feels good. So thank you, and welcome to my community if you're new here. I'd also like to give a shout out to all of those who have been YouTube members throughout the year and then left. I do appreciate the support, even if you can't maintain it. And then I appreciate those who are able to help support me monetarily. It does help me kind of keep going. So looking forward to the next year, though. Looking forward to nerding out about more Magic the Gathering and climbing Mythic, all of that fun stuff. You can always drop by on Twitch, too. I tend to stream on the weekends, doing some draft, usually. And with that, have a wonderful, happy holiday, and then also, happy New Year, because I think by the maybe next week I'll be able to get in. Okay, yeah, no, we're not quite at the New Year stream yet. All right, enough rambling from me. Take care, everybody. Have a good one, and I'll catch you later.